All right, well, thank you so much for joining us. If you're joining us over Facebook, welcome. Today, we're super excited to have our presentation on the Spanish Baroque by Karen Hjalmarson, MA. And if you are joining us over Facebook, if you have any questions while Karen is presenting, please feel free to go ahead and drop those questions into our comment section, and we'll be happy to address those at the very end. We'll be monitoring those, and we'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have at the end. Otherwise, though, without any further ado, I'd be happy to introduce Karen, and she can go ahead and take today away.
Thank you so much, Samantha. We're really lucky to have such a great cast of interns, and Samantha is our newest intern. She is a graduate student at UC Davis in art history, and so it's wonderful to have her join the group. Let's begin with some of the background information on the Spanish Baroque. When Samantha created this PowerPoint for me, I applauded her for placing one of the most beautiful still life images ever created in Western art, and that is this 𝗔𝗥𝗧𝗦𝗥𝗲. This 𝗔𝗥𝗧𝗦 painting happens to be in the Norton Simon Museum in Pasadena. And I often prior to COVID, made many pilgrimages to this painting because in all of art history, this is considered one of the most beautiful still lifes ever created. Peter Stedall from the New Yorker wrote a whole thesis on this, that this is in so many ways one of the most beautiful. With that said, let me give you a little background on Spain during this time. It's really important to kind of understand the political and religious significance. Well, let's start with the religious significance. You're going to see very devoutly Catholic images throughout this presentation. That is because this Catholic Church maintained strong control over Spain and some of the southern countries. If you recall, Holland bifurcated itself from Spain and the Habsburg rule and maintained its Protestant religious control. So during the 16th century, with the likes of Calvin, John Calvin, and Martin Luther, we had the advent of Protestant sects in the northern countries, Switzerland, Holland, and so forth. And that was during the 16th century. By the 17th century, Holland, as I just said, was Protestant, and but Belgium still maintained its control under the Catholic Church and the Habsburg Empire. And the Protestants in Holland started creating much less religious imagery in their paintings. Some other things that are going on. Spain during the 16th century was the most powerful country in Europe. However, its armada was extremely powerful. Isabel and Ferdinand were sponsoring exploration. However, by the 17th century, Spain had undergone tremendous amount of war. We had a horrible Inquisition that was actually kicking out Jews and Muslims, and that diminished a lot of brain power, brain trust in those countries. Unfortunately, the Catholic Church also sort of dictated a lot that was going on along with the Habsburgs. Now, under the time period that we're going to be discussing, the 17th century, we had Philip IV and Charles II. They were not the strongest rulers. Philip II and the Third were much more powerful and stronger. We also have a lot of economic deprivation in Spain. So even though it's a golden age of painting, it was a crisis. We had the 30 Years' War, the 80 Years' War. In the 17th century, many historians believe that we had more wars than any other time in recorded history. So let's look at some of the paintings, and we'll discuss some of the techniques that you will see during this time. Now, I am going to begin with a Renaissance painting. And 𝗔𝗥𝗧𝗦𝗥𝗲𝗰𝗵 is painted here by her teacher. She actually came to she came to Spain to paint for the court, but she was an Italian. She met Michelangelo, and she traveled throughout Italy, went to Spain under one of the Habsburgs to work for the Queen. She actually, in the 16th century, became the art teacher for the Queen of Spain. So here we have a very interesting portrait. It kind of establishes the relationship of male and female during the 16th century. Of course, Men could have a lot of freedom in their painting, women not so much. And they were kind of relegated to just portraits. And they also had a lot of control by the male-dominated culture at that time. What is so interesting about this painting is the 𝗔𝗥𝗧𝗦𝗥𝗲𝗰𝗵, she is being painted, but she paints the painting. So it's her teacher painting her, Campi, and he paints her with 3 arms. Now, you might say 3 arms. Well, at first, this was not known. But when some of the varnish was taken off the painting, they saw the 𝗔𝗥𝗧𝗦𝗥𝗲𝗰𝗵, which is the painting underneath, revealed that this was a painting with 3 arms. So what we have here, and I'm going to point it out, we have a shoulder here of 1 arm, second arm here with a beautiful ruby bracelet, and right here we have another arm that is meant to sort of grab the brush of her patron mentor. So that is a kind of an unusual thing. Then we have this very beautiful light. And as we were discussing earlier, some of the staff, we were talking about the difference between tenebrism and chiaroscuro, which is a form of intense light. The Italians used chiaroscuro. A lot of it came from artists like Caravaggio, who was studied by many of these Spanish artists. And you have to remember that a lot of the Flemish artists like Peter Paul Rubens was in Spain at the court for more than 20 years. So there was a lot of inspiration by the Italians who came and the Flemish. So this is, we would probably consider more tenebrism, which is black against white, rather than white shining through a white background. So this is a form of tenebrism. You know, her success as a portrait painter was so strong that Anthony van Dyck came to Italy. She went back to Italy after many years at the court of Spain, and he actually painted her at 93. She lived to the ripe old age of 93. Really quickly, how did she connect with the royal courts? Her family was also nobility, although they were rather poor nobility, sort of a oxymoronic term, but her family was originally from the Byzantium, went to Cremona, where they were nobility, and then they started interacting with the courts. All right, so this is actually Renaissance as a prelude to our Baroque presentation. Perhaps if you look at these still life paintings, you will see almost a religious beauty. And Still Life with Quince, Cabbage, and Melon and Cucumber is by Juan Sanchez Coton, and he is actually in the SDMA collection. San Diego Museum of Art has this magnificent still life. Well, there's a lot to be said about this. Of course, let's look at that light, this tenebrism, this extreme light and dark. What the Spanish Baroque artist did, which was very unique from the Flemish and the Dutch, was his use of such a stark background. He also frequently, Coton put the images in a windowsill. So this is very true to what he painted, this windowsill and the very stark black, inky black in the back. Now, why are these fruits and vegetables hanging? You notice you don't see where it is hanging. You only see a string drawn down. Part of this could be 2 or 3 things. First of all, there was no refrigeration at the time. And so in order to preserve fruits and vegetables and also to keep them away from pests, they frequently tied them up. And I can attest to this because as a young recent graduate, a college undergrad, I went to Spain for a summer and lived in a little town outside of Madrid called Zamora. It was a little medieval town. And I lived in a 15th century building, very old building, and there was no hot water. And we hung or placed our fruits and vegetables in a windowsill, just like this, to keep them cool. Now, another thing this could relate to is the celestial studies by people like Galileo. Now, Galileo did not point his telescope to the stars until 1609. But the Spanish explorers, remember, they were great explorers. They had an amazing armada and navy. They were going out to the New World all over. So they knew how to use the stars to guide them. So that is a reference to the study of celestial bodies. That is part of it. Also, This is hyperbolic curve by Archimedes. And if you can look at the melon open and sliced here, we can see two half curves that represent that hyperbolic algebraic model. So he's referencing a deep mathematical exploration. The other thing is how he cantilevers this beautiful cucumber over the ledge. And that actually shows his virtuosity. Many Dutch artists would do that. They would cantilever fruit or vegetables over the tabletop or a ledge to show that they could, that they were very capable. A couple of things about Coton. He worked in Sevilla, and if I'm not mistaken, and he eventually gave up his painting for the court and for the church. And remember, the church and the court are the main benefactors of the Spanish Baroque. He gave it up. He became a Carthusian monk, and he took with him very little because it's an order of piety and poverty. But he did have 12 magnificent still lifes, and that was done before when he was a lay person, before he became a very religious person. So he's quite a fascinating artist. And to me, this is one of the most beautiful still lifes in all of Western Europe. Let's go to one more, and I won't talk too much about this, Still Life with Lemons. There's not a lot of information on this. Of course, it was painted before he went into the monastic life. Again, we have this tenebrism, this white, stark, modeled picture against this inky black. It helps to create perspective when he positions the images and the objects on this type of tabletop. You can see the shadows and light. What makes this so unique is, again, where is this hanging from? Why is it hanging like this? It also relates to the fact that these are part of the natural world, and the Spanish Baroque artists were really set on capturing realism and naturalism, because the Catholic Church did dictate, because this is Counter-Reformation. And what I mean by that is the Spanish painters were trying to represent the importance of the Catholic Church and not to move away as the Protestants had. So when they paint, not particularly this one, because it isn't necessarily too religious, they would want to make things realistic enough for people to read it and understand it. But this is a more secular painting, even though it has sort of religious overtones. We do look at the lemon, and we see that it is part of the natural world, except its austerity and beauty can relate to divine elegance. Now, we're going to move on to one of the greatest painters of the early Spanish Baroque, and that is El Greco. El Greco grew up in the island of Crete, which was controlled by the Venetians, so he had a lot of inspiration from the Venetian painters Titian and Tintoretto. The other thing is, if you look at the date, I'm sorry, this date, 1506, is incorrect. The painting was done in 1588, which puts it more in the Mannerist tradition. And the Mannerist tradition evolved in Italy after the Renaissance. Some people would actually say that Mannerism is part of the Renaissance, and some people say it is the segue between Baroque and Renaissance and Baroque. So let's talk a little bit about El Greco. Some people would say that this is the most important religious painting done in the Spanish Baroque. It was done in the town of Toledo. He did work in Toledo for much of his career, not all of it, but much of his career. And he decorated many churches. As again, the Catholic Church had so many projects for these artists. They painted monasteries, small churches, the patrons of great churches, and also, of course, the aristocracy. So what is happening here? This is a really interesting story. And what you actually have, the burial of Count Orgaz, is two paintings. I'm terribly sorry. The celestial painting, which is at top, divided by these heads of important members of the Toledo aristocracy, and they're all dressed in black with their ruffled collars. And so let's get back to the story. Count Orgaz was a very important knight benefactor, religious figure. He was a great philanthropist, and he gave a lot of money to a particular church, the Church of Tomas and Santo de Tomas in Toledo. And what happened is the church absorbed this great amount of money, and they didn't do anything to recognize or thank the count. But this one man here, a Father Nunez, seen here, he said, wait a minute, this count, he gave so much money to this church, to our programs, let's honor him. And so 250 years later, the count died about 1310, they decided to honor him with this painting by this great El Greco. So what do we have here? We have the Count 𝗔𝗥𝗧𝗦𝗥𝗲 being buried by Saint Stephen and Saint Augustine. What's interesting, however, is they're burying him with their hands, not with a shovel. Why is that done? Well, they honor his pure piety and importance. Something else that's kind of interesting is we actually have El Greco here. We have El Greco right here. That's his own portrait, the artist. And we have his young son, and he extends his hand. And then we have a series of very important figures from, as I said, aristocracy. But what do we have here? Oh my goodness, these wraith-like figures, this religious figures, Jesus, Mary, St. John, I believe he's here. And what we have is an icy landscape, I should say a heavenscape, an icy heavenscape, and these wraiths, these ghost-like figures watching as this scene of burial takes place. What you can see in El Greco is this very elongated structure of the body, and that relates to his manneristic tendencies. We also think that El Greco had his own particular vision. If you look stylistically, his work is so unique. It reminds me of much later in the 19th century, the work of Modigliani, which is that elongated neck and the small faces. Of course, he was influenced by El Greco. The other thing that El Greco does that is so remarkable is he creates this dialogue with the colors, because he actually felt that color was the most important aspect of a painting. And then we have these rich robes and these embroidered with red and gold. We have a little, looks like almost like a little tapestry here. So as I stated, to many people, this religious painting is probably one of the most beautiful in all of the later part of the 16th and early 17th century in Spain. Now, we're going to move on to one more painting by El Greco, and this was done very later in his life. And it's unfortunate about this painting is that it was damaged. And what do I mean by that? If you look at the top portion of the painting, it looks like it was cut off, and indeed it was. In an effort to restore it, I believe it was in the 19th century, the top portion was destroyed. It was cut and then lost. So we actually have a very truncated image. What do we see here? This is part of the book of Revelations, the last book in the New Testament, and it's St. John receiving salvation from God. And how he received salvation, this is of course St. John, and he was beheaded by Herod. He was one of the earliest and most vigorous disciples of Jesus and defenders of Jesus. And he was martyred, of course, but he does receive salvation from God. And how he receives salvation is in the clothing, this white gray wrap that he is given. And we can see that these martyred souls are begging God to clothe them so they can get redemption. And then you see them enveloped in these beautiful cloaks. And again, I want to point out these very elongated torsos and necks, very otherworldly. And that again is that manneristic style of distortion. Now, a couple words that I want to talk about a little bit too is that, you know, I mentioned that Rubens influenced a lot of these artists, and Rubens definitely was in Spain around this time. But there's some words that are probably really important to looking at what we're seeing, because this is a very dramatic painting. And drama and tension were words that apply very significantly to the Spanish Baroque. When I say movement, it's emotional. Look at this emotion, rapture. On the face of St. John, we have exuberance, and look as the figures reach out to God. We have tension, and it's almost sensuous when you look at the, the naked forms and how they reach out. So these adjectives, realism, drama, movement, very much apply to the stark and dramatic works of these Spanish painters. Next, we're going to go on to the Martyrdom of St. Andrew by 𝗔𝗦𝗧𝗦𝗥𝗲. 𝗔𝗦𝗧𝗦 was one of the best figurative painters of the Spanish Baroque. He worked in, I believe, in Sevilla. The cities that were of great importance to the Spanish Baroque were Toledo, Sevilla, Madrid, and Valencia. And when we look later at the work of Velázquez, for example, he worked primarily in Madrid because he worked for the court. So let's talk about this highly religious painting. Who was St. Andrew? St. Andrew was actually a saint who preached. His brother was Peter, and he's one of the saints, one of the first saints to come out in support of Jesus. And of course, he was martyred. He preached to the Scythians, so he became very popular on the Black Sea region. And actually today, he is one of the most important saints for the Russian Orthodox Church, also for the Scottish Church. So he is an important saint in other cultures. What are we looking at? We see this emaciated saint, exquisitely painted with this tenebrism, just beautifully stark against the cloth and background. He's emaciated. You can see the sinewy, the muscle is amazing. And his ankles are being bound very tightly. He is so bony. You can see the protrusions of the hips. And what is happening to him? He's being martyred for his beliefs. And what they're saying is, listen, you have a choice. You can either give up your religious beliefs and your support of Jesus and save yourself, or you can be martyred on this X-style cross, which is very unique, which is actually used now in many flags and pendants in countries like Scotland and in Russia, but he denounces it. He's preparing his body for martyrdom. What is being held in front of him is an icon that is of let's put it this way, not appropriate for this religious conversion. It's an idol, so it would not be appropriate. St. Andrew's is not interested. So what we have is the mourners here, and we have the men, the Romans, who will torture him. The Romans tortured him, beheaded, crucified him as one of the earliest prophets and saints. So this is the cross. This is using tenebrism, very stark and deep. Now, when you look at this painting, you can also see the influence of Caravaggio. Caravaggio, of course, introduced chiaroscuro, which, as we discussed earlier, is a little less intense, but they definitely looked at the work of Caravaggio, one of the greatest light painters in all of Western art. So we will now move on to another painting by 𝗔𝗦𝗧𝗦𝗥𝗲, Head of a Bearded Man, or a study of St. James of Compostela. And what happened here is that this is, even though it states it as a study of St. James, we're going to talk a little bit about James, and his brother was John, and he too was an early martyr. His strength as a religious figure was so intense that they actually now, and from the medieval times and during the times of the Crusades, people even today would go to Compostela to seek healing and for religious conversion and for just mystical healing properties. So to this day, people still go there as a pilgrimage. And what you're seeing too is the devotion on the face of this man. And again, this light and this realism, because as I mentioned before, the Spanish church and even the court really wanted people to look at these paintings and be able to kind of understand what was happening. This is very realistic. There's no confusion as to the devotion of this man and to his importance. You can look, he looks very seriously at us, but he's intent on his religious duties. And just for time's sake, I'm going to move on, and we're going to look more carefully at this magnificent still life by Francisco de Zurbarán. Zurbarán was also very religious. And what you're looking at actually is a still life that is the cross between the spiritual world and the temporal world, or the world on earth. So it is very religious still life. And we know this because this teacup with water is actually representative of the purity and spirituality of the Virgin Mary. So we have a rose representing the Virgin Mary and the water, the beautiful water. Now, what are other aspects of this painting? I'm going to talk about these citrons. The citrons relate to lemons, but they're the early, the originators of lemons. They were actually like the father and mother of lemons. They're thicker in peel, so they're a little bigger. And then we have these beautiful Valencia style oranges. When Zurbarán painted this, he was very tied to commissions by the Catholic Church, for the Catholic Church, I should say. And he was doing all manner of saints and religious conversion and things like that. But he was one of the most gifted still life painters. His oeuvre of still life paintings is very limited. Interestingly enough, his young son wanted to devote his career to basically still life painting. And he was a tremendous still life painter. However, he died young. So this tradition from the Zurbarán family did not continue. So what we have here is a tabletop that is designed as an altar, which reinforces the religious nature of this painting. It is created as an altar for religious and spiritual contemplation. It's natural. It is amazing to see the realism in this basket, the weaving, the texture. Look at the leaves and the orange blossoms. Look how geometrically perfect this painting is. The equidistance from each object, each separated by space that is calibrated. And we also have three distinct still lifes. We have one drawn here and one drawn here. So going back, we'll just wrap it up to say that this is done by a very religious painter. It is the crossing of the spiritual and real world. It relates to venerating the Virgin Mary and creating an altarpiece for contemplation. If you have not seen this painting, it is very large. I will tell you that it is worth a trip to the Norton Simon. Hopefully it will open soon, and maybe it is already open after COVID. I just want to show you one more painting that is so remarkable, also by Zurbarán. And again, you can see his ties to Catholicism and the religion of the Catholic Church. We are very lucky to have Agnus Dei, which means the Lamb of God. It is in the San Diego Museum of Art, and it is showing the Passion of Christ, the last events in the life of Christ. And here he is being, the young lamb where Jesus is being bound for crucifixion. It's hard to determine if the lamb has already died. The eyes look like they're at half mast, and maybe that is already determined. We have these twirling horns, we have the pink nose, and then the hyper realistic fur, and even the spaces in between the fur, and we have the bound hooves. Again, he, like Coton, sets the image into a windowsill or a ledge, and it occupies the space. It takes up most of the space. So again, this relates to the sacrifice of Jesus, and it is during the Passion of Christ. And you can see this magnificent, one of the greatest works by Zurbarán in the San Diego Museum of Art, which is now open. All right, we are lucky to have our own Zurbarán. And this is one of the latest acquisitions of the museum. And if I'm not mistaken, it was acquired on the 50th anniversary of the Timken. And so we have St. Francis, who was one of the most important saints. He was a saint of the environment. He loved animals so much. He preached to the birds. People often show him. He was depicted over 34 times by 𝗔𝗦𝗧𝗦𝗥𝗲 himself in sketches, in paintings. So many artists from the Netherlandish period, the Dutch and the Flemish, until, of course, Holland became Protestant. So many images of the saint. So the saint is in deep meditation. He is very serious. He looks down upon a skull. And the skull relates to man and also the sins of man and most likely Adam. His face is in sorrow. He looks down, he's meditating. And so, of course, he was one of the most important saints of the Catholic Church. And he's, as I said, his images is ubiquitous in many forms. And this is a rather large, very dark and haunting painting. He looks down as the shadows encase not only his face, but the skull, and his hands clasp the skull tenderly. Now, I've told you this before, but many artists would say that painting hands, as he does so adeptly, is one of the hardest things for an artist to do. And of course, the tenebrism, this hyper dark and light that we see with a little bit of shadow, and a very vertical painting. And please visit this at our very own Timken Museum when we reopen in November. I probably should have put the still lifes back to back. And there's not a lot known about this flowers, fruit in a china bowl, but I again just wanted to point out the virtuosity of 𝗔𝗦𝗧𝗦𝗥𝗲's painting, and most likely the religious connection, the white purity and spirituality. And you see this beautiful, beautiful, exquisite, thin, paper-thin porcelain bowl placed on a very strange kind of platform in a niche windowsill or altarpiece. And then we have the drooping of the flowers and pears in the bowl, in the very fine china bowl. And it also relates to the fact that this was the age of exploration, the 17th century, for the Dutch, for the Flemish, for the British, and for the Spanish. And so not so much at this time for the Spanish. As I said, they were mired in war. Economically, they weren't doing very well. They actually called it the time of crisis in Spain, but they still had connections to other regions, particular, for example, the Far East, and that's most likely where the bowl originated. They had gone to the New World. And so at a time, in the 16th century, they were quite wealthy because they had all the land and the gold and things coming from the New World. But at the same time, they were also suffering from all these battles and internal conflict. Now, I am going to tell you that one thing I forgot to mention, and I'm going to go back because I think it's really important. When we look at this painting, we see these specific fruits and vegetables. And I did want to point out that all of them were bought by the Spanish to the New World for cultivation. So all of these, this open, beautiful melon with the seeds and the quince and cabbage and cucumber, were all Spanish or near Spanish territory, and then they were brought to the New World. And of course, pears, Spain has warm climate, so we would have a lot of flowers and vegetation there. Now we're going to go to the work of Ribalta. And Ribalta, too, was one of the greatest figurative painters, as we could see earlier, one of the greatest figurative painters of the Spanish Baroque. And he's definitely influenced by Caravaggio. And we can see this intense light and perhaps more of a chiaroscuro than tenebrism here because we have so much white. And so who was Saint Bernard? Saint Bernard was a French monk, a very devout and religious monk, and he is looking with intense rapture at Jesus as Jesus is descending from the cross. So Jesus is descending from the cross. He's actually kind of at half, he's almost at half position. And what I mean by this is his body is being lowered. And Saint Bernard, this French saint, is so enraptured that he's he's almost beyond recognition. He's in rapture. He holds his body, tries to hold his body secure, but he really can't. He's in such spiritual trance that Jesus actually is trying to hold him up. And you can see Jesus' arms as he captures the elbow so he doesn't fall. And then what's really interesting is that Jesus looks at him with such love and devotion. Just a beautiful spiritual element to this painting. Again, very realistic and naturalistic. Naturalistic, and then we're looking at the natural world, even though this is a spiritual image, but realistic in look at the musculature of the arms, the beauty of the hands. Is a very masculine, these are very masculine bodies, very three-dimensional. And but what is unusual, and of course we see the crucifixion is very realistic, but we look at these faces who are witnessing this scene, and they do not adhere to the same kind of realism as you would see in the figure of Saint Bernard and and Jesus. So it's unusual that these are more, and maybe metaphorically representing their less importance. Of course, they were attendants. They weren't saints or Jesus, but it shows that they're in the background, kind of witnessing this scene. And we will go on. All right. One of my favorite paintings of the Spanish Baroque, and probably some would consider the masterpiece of the Spanish Baroque, is this painting by Diego Velázquez. I am going to spend quite a bit of time on this painting because it is so rich and multifaceted. So let's talk a little bit about Velázquez. He was part of the court in Madrid of Philip IV's family. And Las Meninas actually relates to the ladies in waiting. The original title of this painting was listed, Philip IV and his wife and the court, and it's a strung, a lot of different notifications on the title, but it has taken on Las Meninas, the ladies in waiting. So what do we have? We have an amazing, this is an Alcazar Palace in Madrid. And actually this space, this cave-like space, is actually the very space of Velázquez. This is where he painted. And so here is this big canvas. Wow. And here is our very own Velázquez painting. Who is he painting? He's not painting the little Infanta, the little princess. He is painting her parents, Philip IV and his wife. Now, the Habsburgs at this time were very inbred. I'm sorry to use such a strange term, but they're very inbred. And we begin to see, even in a distance, this kind of Habsburg facial characteristics, this Habsburg chin, because the inbreeding began to diminish their ability to rule, their characteristics of sanity and intelligence. That was beginning to wane. But Velázquez is painting them, and they are being reflected in this mirror. What do we have above the mirror? Here we have paintings by Peter Paul Rubens, because Rubens was in the court of Spain in, I think it was something like 1605 to 1625. So Velázquez had ample time to see the work of Rubens. He was attached to the Habsburg court, although he did go back to Antwerp, Belgium, where he was from, and he actually continued to work for the Habsburgs. Now, what do we have here? We have two paintings by Rubens, because Velázquez loved his work and painted it. We have one of the important managers of the court, and he stands in the doorway. We have two, and I hope this is not a pejorative term, two dwarfs who were part of the entourage of the king, and even one of them kicks one of the dogs, sort of a little bit unfairly. And here we have one of the ladies in waiting as she gives a glass of water to the princess, and we have a second lady in waiting, waiting for so any kind of request. And then we have some of the attendants and parts of the members of the church here. So What's so interesting about this painting, it's a genre painting, it's a portrait painting, and it uses so many interesting devices. This 𝗔𝗥𝗧𝗦𝗥𝗲 coming from a window and coming from a doorway, which is an unknown light source. Now, Velázquez was not the first artist to paint the reflection in a mirror. Who did that? Well, our own beautiful Jan van Eyck, the Netherlandish master, 15th century master. And in the portrait of Arnolfini, he captures a reflection in a mirror in the space, in the interior space. And also later on, we have other artists who use this device very successfully. So again, this is painting of the Habsburg family. Just a little point, the Infanta did marry, and she had a very exalted position. However, she died at the age of 21 or 22. She had had a thyroid condition, and then multiple births, and then bronchitis. And so, of course, medicine was not very developed then, so she did die at a very young age. So this painting, one of the greatest paintings ever done in all of art history, and in particular in the Spanish Baroque. Now, along with one of the greatest genre paintings, Velázquez also painted what many believe is one of the most important portraits ever done. And this is a portrait of Pope Innocent. And he was a member of the Pamphylia family. And he was a very intelligent, thoughtful man. He's beginning to age. You can kind of see that in his face. He looks at us with candor and insight. And he was very skeptical, however, to have his portrait done. He did see the work of many of his family members who were aristocrats, and he decided, maybe this Velázquez can paint my painting. And you might say, well, if he was an Italian pope, why was he painted by a Spanish painter? Well, that's because Velázquez made a couple trips to Italy, to Rome, and he was introduced to the Pope. Some people suggest that Juan de Paredes, that amazing painting by Velázquez of his servant, was also a catalyst for the Pope allowing Velázquez to paint this, because he looked at it and said that it's so true to life, I think I'll allow it. Now, one point I'm going to make is the robes he wears, the garments he wears indicate that it is summertime. These are light vestments, a light cloak. You can see the ring, the papal ring, and he holds a paper, and actually what the paper says is just a signature of Velázquez. He is in a throne, which is embellished gold, and then you can see the light as it falls, it shadows his crimson garb. And then, of course, the body is mirrored in this black shadow. If you like 20th century art as I do, you have probably seen the Pope, the Screaming Popes, by none other than Francis Bacon. Francis Bacon was one of the most important painters of the 20th century, British painter, related actually to the philosopher Francis Bacon. He was Irish, his family disowned him, and he went to London and painted and became one of the most important artists of the London School. Today, these Screaming Popes sell for tens and tens of millions of dollars. So many people feel that this painting, this portrait, the candor, the capturing the sort of insightful face of this Pope was one of the masterpieces of portraiture ever done. Now, our very own Murillo. Murillo is interesting because I believe he worked in Sevilla. He was interesting because even though it's a very dramatic painting of the crucifixion, many of his works were a little softer, a little sweeter than some of the other artists, and who I'll make a comparison in just a second. This is a very large crucifixion. It is in our Timken collection. One of the masterpieces of Murillo's painting. He did another one, which is in the Prado, with a little bit of a different twist, pardon me. The twist is that here, he looks up to God and beseeches God before he dies. And in the Prado version of that Murillo paints, we have the figure of Christ looking down. So we have the crucifixion, we have Jesus, King of the Jews in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew up here. We have Adam in the area where Christ was martyred, and you can see the background of Jerusalem. The skull and bone, the tibia and skull relate to where Christ was martyred and the sins of man. So we have that here. Now, it's very painterly here. These are more gestural brushstrokes. We can see that also the influence of the Flemish Baroque here. Rubens used a lot of this gestural painting, but then we have a hyper-realism, the tenebrism of the Spanish painters, the stark white, the body as it is shadowed against this inky night, and the cloud formations here, and the blood as it runs down the arm. Again, you can see his gift of painting the human body as he is martyred here with the blood dripping off the feet. It's very tense, it's very beautiful. And again, this points out to the quest of the Spanish church, the Catholic Church, to counter what is happening in the Protestant countries in the north. So in the south, we have this maintenance of the Catholic Church and the Catholic religion, but they still want to keep people from moving into Protestant sects. So they have this counter-reformation. It's almost like propaganda. The propaganda meaning, look at this painting. Look how magnificent, how important, how spiritual it is. And perhaps you too will see the divine right of the Catholic Church. And so that, and then again, we also have things like the Inquisition that was really affecting the reputation, let's say, of what is going on in Spain. Now, we don't have a lot of time, so I want to go through. I wanted to show you that Murillo is very much influenced by the Dutch as well as the Flemish painters. And he uses kind of a Dutch model here, not just the women, but the way she is hovered over the windowsill. And she is very sweet and very pretty and very kind of candy box-like. So what I want to show you is this comparison to the next artist I'm going to show you, who is much more serious. And not to say that crucifixion wasn't serious, but Murillo likes sort of the softer side of things. And he shows a non-religious, this is an aristocrat, and she's gazing out a window and she smiles. She's very, very beautiful, the tonality of white against the white and dark trim. And this is her companion. In the upper classes in Spain, it was very important to have an older companion who kind of monitored you. And you can see that instead of smiling, because she is a servant to this aristocrat, she covers her mouth, which was considered very polite and very reminiscent of what you would see in aristocratic circles. And look at the realism and naturalism, the naturalism of her face, the realism of the shutter, and that inky black, which is so ubiquitous in the Spanish Baroque. Now, Murillo paints this Virgin of the Rosary, and it really, even though of course way before photography, but if we look at it, it almost seems to capture a photographic realness of the mother and child. They are very natural, very realistic. And if you didn't realize that it was the Virgin Mary, you would probably think it's just an aristocrat being painted with her child. But what is so beautiful about this painting is look how they hug each other, just mother and son, with depth and beauty and love. And then you have her red gown, this crimson gown. And then we have a beautiful cloak that she's resting on. And of course, those are the colors of the Virgin Mary. We have a form of the baby Jesus that is very naturalistic. And if we look at some of the earlier works, particularly Netherlandish painting, we see the depictions of Jesus in a much more rudimentary form, not as three-dimensional. He stands clutching his mother with his chubby little legs. They hold the rosary between them, and they're cheek to cheek. So it shows a softer side of Murillo, unlike the next painter I'm going to show you. And I'm moving a little more quickly because we're almost at the end, but I do want to leave a few minutes for question and answers. Okay, Juan de Valdés Leal. he knew Murillo. They actually painted together and at some time, and he was a very religious and devout painter. And what we have here is a much harsher, more emotional style of painting. What's also very unique about it, if you compare it to the brushstrokes in the Murillo, it's much more gestural, and you can see how the Impressionists, like Manet, would look at the work of, well, particularly Velasquez in terms of Manet, but some of the early pre-Impressionists, Impressionists, they use some of these gestural style here to capture the background. And what we have is Jesus just weighed down by this heavy, heavy cross. And we can see very distinctly a crown of thorns, and less distinctly some blood dripping down his face. He's bleeding, he's being tortured. We have his torturers here in the background. We have people crying and weeping to signify this horrible thing that has happened. And it's very abstracted. If you were to look at this, you would perhaps think it wasn't done in the 17th century. It's much more painterly, much more gestural, and also harkens to what happens later in the Rococo. Not in terms of palette, but this looser, more gestural brushstroke. And one more, the sacrifice of Isaac. Now, stylistically, if we make this comparison, they're done about the same time, but stylistically, they're quite different. And the sacrifice of Adam, actually comes from the Old Testament and Jewish tradition. And what we have is Isaac was so devoutly religious that he wanted to show God in some manner that his belief was strong. He didn't believe in idols, and that he, if forced to, might have sacrificed his own son Isaac. Now, many people believe that God never intended Isaac, even though there was some suggestion, to sacrifice his own son, to bind him and sacrifice him. He didn't really intend for him to do it, but he saw how important Isaac felt that God was to the Hebrew people and so forth. So he decided to take the knife away, and he's grabbing the knife from Isaac and saying, no, we will sacrifice a lamb. You do not need to give up your firstborn son. So here we have Isaac, again, this hyper realism. He's in shock. He doesn't really know what's happening. Isaac seems to be, of course, I move forward, seems to be satisfied that this will not take place. The angel grabs his arm. Look at the swirling red and wings and this very gestural background. We do have the introduction of landscape, not as significant as we saw with the Italians, where we see the incorporations, particularly in the Renaissance and then into the Baroque, of landscape. But here we have almost a full landscape with this three-dimensional Isaac in the foreground. Because of time, I'm just going to go through the last couple images and go back a little bit to still life. And Juan de Areno was the most important, besides Zurbarán and Coton, the most important still life painter in this time period. And one thing I do want to mention, though, if you look at this, you would suggest a Flemish stylistic concerns. And of course, that is very true. This is very reminiscent of the Dutch and Flemish. And of course, they had seen the work of these, particularly the Flemish artists. And so we have this plethora of, beautiful flowers, the tulips that were so popular in Holland at this time, and also in Flanders. And we have the irises and the carnations and the white flowers. They were amassed in this kind of pile type of style. They are laid out very horizontally, it's very vertical. You see this rough-hewn tabletop, which is a great juxtaposition to this Venetian glass goblet, which holds the flowers. And it is so realistic that you can even see the petals as they droop into the water and that exquisite water. So probably this is less religious. These still life paintings were so popular that Reno actually had a little shop outside, I believe it was in Madrid, and he sold these to make money because except for the great artists like Velázquez and some of the others who had church or aristocratic patronage, a lot of these artists kind of suffered. Painters were not considered at the very high level of society. And so they sometimes had to supplement their income. Just really quickly, this one, I want to show you that not all artists good artists create great masterpieces. And I'm not saying that this isn't worthy of notice, but it isn't as successful. The pears, the skin on the pears is a little odd. We have the peaches that are not exactly naturalistic. The curve of the fruit is rather unusual. The space is very crowded. So in a comparison, we would say that this one, of course, is much more successful. And then lastly, I just want to show one more painting. And it was very common with his signature here at the bottom. It was very common for the Spanish artists, and I showed you that with the 𝗔𝗥𝗧𝗦𝗥𝗲, to paint flowers in a basket, as opposed to a lot of intricate vases. Remember, in the age of exploration, these individuals were going into other countries and bringing back beautiful porcelain and glass. But here we often see the more naturalistic basket and this profusion of flowers. Well, I see my time is up, except for I would love any questions. So Samantha will guide us through that question and answer period. And please feel free to ask. I hope I can give you a good response, but look, maybe we'll try it out.
Thank you so much, Karen. That was such a fascinating presentation. Thank you so much. Yes, if anyone has any questions, you can either feel free to unmute yourself, go ahead and ask Karen, or there is a chat section here on Zoom. You can go ahead and hit that button and type in your question there, and we'd be happy to answer any of those. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to chime in.
And particularly, even if you want to just discuss one of your favorite and have me bring it back up and we can look at it again and maybe talk about it a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. Spanish Baroque is such a rich time. There's so much to talk about, and there's such a diversity too. I know sometimes a lot of people don't necessarily, one of the reasons that I really liked your presentation is sometimes a lot of people don't really think about still lifes when they think about something like the Baroque, right? So it's really, you know, they think about like the big religious paintings, right? And things like that.
Oh, you're so right about that.
Right.
Because, you know, that is so true because, you know, of course, the church was commissioned, as I mentioned, for monasteries, for small churches, for private devotion. And they were decorating these magnificent palaces as well. So when the palaces like Alcazar, for example, was being created, or the Retiro Palace, they needed a lot of work. And some of it wasn't always religious. But it wasn't, you know, the development of still life like you might see in Holland, where you had a more middle-class citizenry and they wanted to decorate their homes. And so still lives were very real, and they loved their homes, so they wanted something to decorate. But just as you said, Samantha, look at this compared to some of those devoutly religious paintings that we saw earlier. So yes, this could be French or Flemish, very much so. So you're very right about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's see here. Looking through. Otherwise, though, any other questions, any comments? While, you know, kind of you may be thinking about questions, I would like to say that this tour and any of our tours really, if you wanted to go back and watch, are going to be posted on our YouTube and also on our social media channels. So on our Facebook page, you can go back and look through our videos and, you know, kind of catch any of the tours there. This one will be there. So we'll, you know, kind of other tours that we've done in the past. So please feel free to kind of check out our social media channels in order to check out any past tours or this tour if you wanted to kind of go back and take a look at any of your other favorite paintings as well.
Thank you so much for pointing that out. And I do want to say that we have these wonderful tours by other docents every Thursday. I do one, my next presentation will be next Thursday, 45-minute presentation, and that will actually be on the Italian Renaissance, because we have some beautiful Italian Renaissance paintings. And also next month on my Wednesday lecture, of my Arts Reach, as this is part of the Art Reach series, I will be doing a post-impressionism. I'm going to go into the latter part of the 19th century and the 20th century. So quite a difference between a Spanish Baroque and post-impressionism, Cezanne, Van Gogh, etc. So I do hope that you can tune into that. So Samantha, I guess, do we not have any questions?
I don't see any right now, but that's totally okay. You know, like I said, you can check out our social media channels for any of these videos. Also, if you were looking for upcoming tours, kind of as Karen mentioned, there are lots of upcoming tours. We have weekly tours, we have kind of monthly series going on. Please go ahead and check out our website, the Timken website. You'll find an events calendar there, and you'll be able to kind of get all the links and things like that for those tours while the museum is still closed. Of course, we hope you will come and visit us once we are open again, but in the meantime, we're happy to be bringing these tours to you guys. So thank you so much for attending today. And thank you again, Karen, for presenting today for such a fascinating presentation. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you for all your assistance. And I'll say goodbye and thank you for our viewers, the Timken viewers. And it's always a pleasure to have people, as many as possible. It's great. So
yes, thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you, Karen. It was wonderful.
Oh, I really appreciate that comment. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yes. Yeah. Enjoy the rest of your day, everyone. Have a great day.